Okay, good afternoon, everyone out there in the dark. So my name is Per Faxneld, and sorry about that. I have a few books on my conscience, but today I will be speaking specifically about one of my books, a book called, Satanic Feminism, first published in 2014 and later republished by Oxford University Press in 2017. Now, this is a 700-page book, so I will be giving you a sort of rollicking ride through it at breakneck pace. It's going to be, let's say, a taste of the fruit of knowledge rather than the entire fruit. And indeed, fruit, forbidden fruit, is at the root of this story that I will tell you today. The story of Satanic Feminism and Lucifer as the Liberator of Woman in 19th-century culture. So what you see up there is a quote from Genesis 3, and it of course details the way that woman was tempted by the serpent and ate of the forbidden fruit and then gave to Adam as well of this fruit. And this narrative has historically been employed in rather nasty ways to justify many things. For example, that women should be silent in church and not participate in theological debates, that women should be subordinate to their husbands, that women should give birth in pain as a punishment for God for accepting the forbidden fruit with no pain relief. It was also used during the early modern persecutions of witches as an argument for why women were more prone to be devil worshippers. In the 19th century, this made the story of Eve a key point in early feminist critiques of Christian mythology. What if, some feminists asked themselves, Satan was a helper bringing enlightenment to mankind? Now that would make Eve a heroine and woman superior rather than inferior for having defied the God that did not want mankind to have knowledge. There are clear parallels here to some of the counter-readings of the Bible by certain Gnostic groups, and we could call this a form of protest exegesis. And another quite interesting thing relating to this story and to the iconography of the devil in general is that it's fairly common in some of the most well-known depictions of this narrative for Satan to be depicted as a woman, as a female entity, or at least as a creature encompassing some female traits. For example, this is Michelangelo, his famous image in the Sistine Chapel, and we see here that Satan has the body of a serpent, but then the torso of a woman. And this is something that we can see in numerous works of art, and also in imagery that's not directly related to the story of the fall. And again, we see here on a 15th century tarot card a hermaphrodite Satan. And this hermaphrodite Satan, of course, is also the one we encounter in this famous engraving by Eliphas Levi. And in Christian demonology, this sort of mixing of animal and human, of male and female, was intended to convey something demonic, a liminality of a dangerous kind. What about Satanism then? Satanic feminism, feminist Satanism. We can see that Satanism in the 19th century was already established as a sort of language of resistance before feminists adopted it, established among romantics and early socialists. However, as a self-identification or an actual religious practice, Satanism, properly speaking, does not appear until the late 19th century. However, the idea about Satanists was, present from the beginning of Christianity, but then only as attribution and slander directed at disliked groups like Gnostics, medieval heretics, or witches. So these are some of the most well-known so-called romantic Satanists. And this was not a label they applied to themselves, but rather something that was applied to them by their critics. William Blake, Lord Byron, and Percy Shelley. And Shelley, I would say, is the one that's perhaps most relevant for the development of Satanic feminism, as Shelley himself was an advocate of free love, vegetarian, some sort of atheist, perhaps not in the modern sense of the word, and also an early feminist. And this is something that also appears in one of his literary works, a rather peculiar narrative called The Revolt of Islam, which has a sort of satanic feminist framing to it. And following the Romantics, we also find a sort of praise of the demonic feminine among certain decadents and symbolists. For example, in the works of Algernon Swinburne or the Polish author Stanisław Piszybyszewski, who in fact wrote most of his important satanic texts praising the demonic feminine right here in Berlin. We also find this in works of art, where there's a sort of sacralization of the demonic feminine. For example, in Franz von Stuck's Altar to Sin, with the famous painting Die Sünde as its altarpiece in his palace in Munich. And here's a close-up of that painting. Now, moving to the socialists, we find figures like Mikhail Bakunin, who praises Lucifer as the first anarchist in his text Dieu et l'État. And this was something that could be found across the world, actually. For example, in the United States, there was an anarchist magazine named Lucifer that also combined this sympathy for the devil in a political context with feminist ideas. For example, there's an editorial from 1897 stating, "Lucifer's work is mainly to preach the gospel of discontent to women. As yet, the great masses of women are not awake to the fact that they are slaves, not conscious of their own degradation as individual human beings." We find this also in my home country of Sweden, where there was a Swedish socialist journal called Lucifer, started publication in 1886, where satanic symbolism was prominent. Interestingly, the iconography of this Swedish socialist journal also overlaps with that of the theosophical journal Lucifer, edited by this fascinating woman, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Now, I'm assuming that most of you are somewhat familiar with Madame Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society in the United States in 1875. She was born in present-day Ukraine and supposedly traveled the world before coming to the US and claimed to be in contact with the hidden masters. In her perhaps most influential work, The Secret Doctrine from 1888, there's a very interesting chapter discussing the figure of Satan, where Madame Blavatsky says that Satan should be understood as the father of spiritual mankind who opened the eyes of the automaton created by Jehovah. Satan can only be regarded in the light of a savior, an adversary to Jehovah, who conferred on us spiritual instead of physical immortality. And Satan, she says, is the spirit of intellectual enlightenment and freedom of thought. Theosophy was a movement that offered opportunities for leadership to women, and it intermingled in many ways with the early feminist movement. Madame Blavatsky herself may have been somewhat ambivalent about feminism, but many important feminist figures read a whole lot of Blavatsky. And one of them was Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the United States. She was a suffragette who was deeply inspired by theosophy, and she edited the first large-scale systematic example of criticism of the Bible from a feminist perspective, called The Woman's Bible, published in 2 volumes in 1895 and 1898. In this book, Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes of Satan's powers of conversation and asking puzzling questions that were no doubt marvelous, and he roused in the woman that intense thirst for knowledge. So she has a completely different take here on the story of the fall. And this was necessitated for her due to the fact that many of those who wished to keep women away from power used this biblical narrative as part of their argumentation. And she says that evidently St. Paul was not learned in Egyptian lore, wherefore he was unable to recognize the esoteric meaning of the parable of the fall. Now, what does Egyptian lore refer to here? Well, theosophy, because Blavatsky early on grounded much of her teaching in a supposed Egyptian wisdom. And she was not alone in this. Other American feminists were also very much inspired by theosophy and theosophical counter-readings of the narrative of the fall. One of them was Matilda Joslyn Gage, who wrote the groundbreaking book Woman, Church, and State, a text where she establishes the feminist usage of the term patriarchy. Here, she portrays devil-worshipping witches as rebels against patriarchy. Their Satanism, she writes, is a defiance against, quote, that heaven which permitted the priest and the Lord alike to trample upon all the sacred rights of womanhood, end quote. Now, these ideas she did not perhaps derive directly from theosophy, but rather from this book, La Sorcière, The Witch, by Jules Michelet, who was one of the most popular historians in mid-19th century France. In this book, he portrayed the witch as a sort of proto-socialist figure, and this was something then that Matilda Joslyn Gage picked up on and twisted it into more of a feminist angle on this narrative. And witches, of course, are a sort of identity that some people have taken on through history. One example of this could be the Swedish Easter celebrations, where young children, also male children, dress up as witches and cause mischief. But, whoa, this thing is a bit over-anxious. So, Satanic Feminism was a form of discourse that was explicitly expressed also in a series of literary works by women in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And a key point here is that literary fiction powerfully shapes life worlds. It creates shifts in public discourse, or reproduces it, and that the representation, and in this case, subversion of religion in literature, is therefore of great importance to the historical study of religions. And an interesting example here would be Sylvia Townsend Warner, who was a much celebrated author in the 1920s in the UK, but who subsequently became a bit of a forgotten author, perhaps due to her intense sympathy for Stalinism, which was perhaps not entirely in touch with the times later on. She wrote a wonderful novel called Lolly Willows, or The Loving Huntsman, which is centered around the central character of Lolly Willows, who is a spinster who attempts to get away from her family, who has her do all sorts of chores and take care of younger male family members, by moving to the Cotswolds, a somewhat remote area in the UK, where she encounters the loving huntsman of the title, who in fact is Satan, who liberates her from the confining patriarchal structure of her family and turns her into a witch. And in the novel, Lolly reflects that one doesn't become a witch to run around being harmful, or to run around being helpful either, a district visitor on a broomstick. It's to escape all that, to have a life of one's own, not an existence doled out to you by others. And this sort of feminist message was also something that was picked up on by critics at the time. So, for example, Cape News wrote in 1926, why should Lolly's late-found independence be linked with Satan? Apparently, because it means to her a charming, innocent idleness and a disregard of the conventional claims and routine duties of life. One rather suspects, at least, that the arch-rebel has been introduced because Miss Warner has been longing to impart to the world some interesting thoughts on women, and knows very well that an essay reaches only a select few, while thousands will devour eagerly this vivid tale. And indeed, thousands did. In Paris, a couple of decades earlier, we find this figure, René Vivien, who was, we could say, a propagator of a form of Luciferian lesbian Satanism. So René Vivien was originally an American who grew up in Paris and became infatuated with the decadent movement of the time. And it would perhaps be fair to characterize her as a sort of female Baudelaire. And she wrote poems like this one, where she declared that we hate the aggressive faces of males, the dark breath of Lilith is within us, and the kiss of Iblis to us was terrible and gentle. And she also wrote, the profane Genesis, which sort of postulates two eternal principles, Jehovah and Satan, where Jehovah is identified with everything masculine and Satan identified with everything feminine and therefore positive. And she wasn't entirely alone in this type of poetical project. There's even a German example of this, a woman who wrote under the pseudonym Marie Madeleine, and this is her collection of poems in Seligkeit und Sünden, where we find a form of defiant Luciferian lesbianism again, where she writes, the small insects hissed with their poisonous tongues and lifted jeering heads and deemed it forbidden, homosexual love that is. Let me perish in thy arms, my God and lover, Lucifer. And here are the rather amazing end papers of that collection of poems. Another literary author in the US was Mary MacLane, who became a true literary sensation with her debut novel. She was one of the first truly successful auto-fiction writers, and she employed Satan to reject traditional womanhood. She was such a big phenomenon in her time that there was a baseball team named after her, a soda named after her, and so on and so forth. So she was a huge literary sensation, but subsequently entirely forgotten. Her autofictional narrative revolves around her life in the not-so-exciting city of Butte, Montana, where she fantasizes about Satan arriving and freeing her from all the constraints of patriarchy. And this provocative tale was satirized in caricatures like this. And this was, part of the broader iconography surrounding her. And there's even a dictionary from the time where if you look up the word devil, you find this entry saying, the devil, an old rascal mentioned in the Bible, now reported engaged to Mary MacLane. And here's a parody of Mary MacLane called The Devil's Letters to Mary MacLane. There were also women who sort of enacted an identity as demonic women. We could say that René Vivien, to an extent, did that with her Luciferian lesbianism, where she kept pets like toads and snakes, and she decorated her home in a very extravagant manner. But someone who really took it to the next level was Luisa Casati in Italy, who was at the time the richest, the wealthiest woman in all of Europe. So she had the resources and she had the freedom to do exactly what she wanted. And what did she want to do? Well, she wanted to become a demon woman. Here we see her dressed up as the Queen of Night from Mozart's The Magic Flute, in a costume featuring thousands and thousands of real diamonds. She was also very interested in magic, and practiced various occult techniques together with the symbolist author Gabriele D'Annunzio. And interestingly, Luisa Casati clearly referred to the narrative of Eve and the serpent in many ways, dressing up as Eve for masquerades, keeping serpents as pets, and in her occult library in her Paris house, she had a mural painted by a local artist featuring herself as Eve in intimate conversation with the serpent. Another woman who sort of participated in this enactment of the role as a demonic woman was the actress Sarah Bernard, who sculpted this satanic self-portrait in the 1890s. And here we have Sarah Bernard in her famous bat hat, decorated with a bat, rather wonderful. And here's a handbag she had, and a bracelet. Now, this sort of role as a demon woman, we might think that was something that remained confined to the upper elite of women who could act freely and had the economic resources to stage these sort of things. But interestingly, we also find, going through jewelry catalogs from the time, there are quite a few pieces depicting Eve and the serpent. And the way I would interpret this is that if you put on a piece of jewelry depicting Eve and the serpent and you're a woman, you're not really doing it because you're ashamed of what Eve did, right? You're celebrating this somehow. So this indicates, I would suggest, a sort of democratization of this enactment of a form of satanic, defiant feminism. Ultimately, however, satanic feminism proved not to be a very successful strategy. It was far too controversial for the majority of feminists who remained devoted Christians. Thus, when the suffragettes forged alliances with, for example, the temperance movement, which consisted mostly of pious women who worked to reduce alcohol drinking, in order to get the vote for women, they had to scrap these satanic provocations, like the ones that we found in the Woman's Bible and the texts by Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And this is actually the same pattern that we can observe in the case of socialist Satanist provocations. At some point, it becomes too provocative when you're seeking broad support for your progressive ideas. And to end this, something interesting happened quite recently that proves that these ideas are still highly provocative. In February 2022, a Russian translation of my Satanic Feminism book was published by one of the famously progressive publishers in Moscow. And in September this year, there was a big court case in Russia where this book was judged to be, a form of LGBT propaganda. So in September of this year, the Moscow court fined the Russian publisher of my book, NLO, 400,000 rubles under Article 621 of the Code of Administrative Offenses, the so-called LGBT propaganda law, for publishing and distributing the book. The court found that the publisher had engaged in continuing propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships, and according to court filings included in the case, the defense and publisher admitted the charges. The publisher then removed the book from sale immediately and stated that the remaining unsold copies had been destroyed on August 18 in a warehouse in accordance with the law. Well, that is pretty much it for my talk. I hope it was somehow illuminating and that you enjoyed this little bite of the forbidden fruit.